Welcome back everyone. I bring to you yet another episode of Tell a Friend. Now today is rather a special episode because firstly, you get to see me, which may be fortunate or unfortunate for some of you. But secondly, what truly makes this a special episode is that we were lucky enough to be joined by legendary journalist extraordinaire Zeinab Badawi, who discusses her recent documentary series, The History of Africa. Her documentary series was released en bulk by BBC News Africa and I truly recommend it. Now in this interview we discuss the filming of that series, the politics of African history, and the global movement to decolonise the curriculum. This is my interview with Zeinab Badawi. Okay, first of all let me thank you for agreeing to this interview. And I wanted to speak with you about your recent series, The History of Africa, which was released en bulk by BBC News Africa just a few days ago. And I was wondering if you could begin by telling me what inspired you to make this series.
Well, I should say that, yes, it has gone out on YouTube, but 15 of 20 episodes have gone out on YouTube. There are still 5 remaining, which have to be broadcast on BBC World Television before they can be put online. So you're seeing 3/4 of the series. But very glad to have it on BBC Africa YouTube because it means obviously it can reach a wider audience, including here in the United Kingdom. Why did I want to make this? Well, I studied history as a postgraduate student, so I obviously love history. And the main reason that I wanted to do African history is, first of all, I was born in Africa, in the Sudan myself, although I've lived in the United Kingdom since I was 2. I was born in the Sudan, which is a country which has a very, very rich history. And it always troubled me that people from Sudan actually knew very little about their ancient history. And as I explored this theme a little bit more, I realized it was actually something that was true of many Africans, especially those educated in the West, that they didn't know very much about their early history, pre-colonial history. And so I decided to embark on this long journey of trying to really throw light on an aspect of history which has been occluded, and that is Africa's history, pre-colonial, and especially told from an African perspective.
Now, back in 2017, you called this a Pan-African project. Why was it important for you to integrate the different histories of the different regions, and how did you go about doing that?
It's a very good question. It's just I found that people would say, "Oh, I'm from Southern Africa, so when are you going to make something about Southern Africa?" Or somebody says, "I'm from East Africa. When are you going to do something about East Africa?" And so I say, look, just in the same way that Europeans, regardless of whether they come from Northern Europe or Southern Europe or Central Europe, will see, for example, ancient Greece and Rome as being part of their cultural heritage, and they see that there is a lot that they have in common with these ancient civilizations. They form the foundations for European societies as a whole, and I think that that is something that I wanted to see replicated in Africa, that you wouldn't just hug the part of Africa from which you came, but had more of a continental approach. And so the history of ancient Sudan is as much relevance to you if you come from Southern Africa. The history of Great Zimbabwe is as much of relevance to you if you come from North Africa. And so that's what I mean by it's a Pan-African project. We are all Africans. We all came from this one continent. And therefore, I think that one should not sort of start slicing bits of the continent and say, this is the part I own, and therefore this is the part I want to know about.
And something else that also stood out to me from your TEDx talk was where you spoke about African history being a tool for change. And you said, and I quote, "History from the African point of view is something which allows you to have self-respect, have a reclaimed identity, and help you assert yourself on the social, political, and cultural agenda today." Now, in your estimation, what role can history play in shaping contemporary Africa?
Yeah, I mean, people say, oh, history is something to do with the past and so on, but actually it isn't. It's relevant. You can't understand a people if you don't understand their past. And when you look at the United Kingdom, especially where we're living here, so much of Britain's identity is wrapped up with its history. So it is very obvious that, one's identity is linked to their history. That's something which is stating the obvious. And because Africa's pre-colonial history has been something that's not been related, and Africans themselves have not grasped that narrative themselves, seized the ownership of it. It's for the a large part of it has been told by outsiders, by the Africanists, as opposed to the African historians, paleontologists, archaeologists, anthropologists, and so on. So it's a question of ownership of your own narrative. That's very important in helping forge your own identity, and also seeing how a people understand themselves and their own past within their own cultural context. And so that's why I think that a person's history is very important, because as Wangari Maathai, the very acclaimed late Kenyan Nobel Prize winner, peace laureate, said, you can't enslave a mind that knows itself, that values itself, that understands itself. And history and knowing who you were in the past is a very important part of that. So I think that's what I meant by that particular quote that you gave me there. And it's relevant today because Africans say we're not happy about the narrative about us in the Western media and the international media. And so you've got to seize control of that narrative right from way back. And you've also got to predate it to slavery. So it's not just a history of the transatlantic slave trade and what came after it, but it's also what came before.
Now, it's interesting you said about that, about reclaiming this history. And as we've seen in the past 5 years, there's been this international decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing history agenda that's been spreading, almost a movement. Would you say that this documentary series is in the scope of that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Very much inspired by the decolonize history movement, because, and this is a project that's been ongoing for many, many decades. And I'm very glad to see that younger people now have seized the mantle, because when African countries were decolonized back in the 60s, they said, okay, look, we've decolonized our countries, but we have to decolonize um, our curriculums. And this is something which actually has taken a very, very long time to do. And it still hasn't really been done. If you go to South Africa, you'll still see that a lot of their history is, Jan van Riebeck turned up in the 1560s in the Cape, and there is a lot of work to be done about that. And even when you look at the role that slaves, the transatlantic slave trade, and the riches gained from that, and how much they contributed to building fine cities in countries such as the United Kingdom, that's still a history which still hasn't been properly examined, but it is a movement that's starting. You've seen universities like Cambridge University say, look, a lot of our wealth was based on wealth gained from the transatlantic slave trade. You hear about the movement within cultural institutions like the Victorian Albert Museum, President Macron in France saying we've got to have objects of art that were taken from Africa repatriated. So it is very much part of the zeitgeist, this series, and I see it as being part of this kind of reclaiming narrative.
Now, on the subject of museums, what role do you think Western institutions such as the V&A, the British Museum, what role do you think they could play in helping Africans reclaim their own history?
Well, that conversation has already started, and certainly you hear the British Museum saying it's going to start, giving artifacts on loan at least, and maybe long-term loans. So maybe the issue of ownership won't be solved for some people, but there is an actual repatriation and a return of some objects which is already being done. And so I think cultural institutions and museums do have a large part to play. They're obviously right in saying they want to make sure that there are the secure and correct environments for some of these works of art, which are quite fragile and need to be properly maintained. And when you saw what happened, for instance, in Timbuktu in Mali, which was overrun by extremists, and so you saw that some of the precious artifacts and documents were obviously destroyed. There's got to be a certain amount of security that has got to be guaranteed. So the recipient nations have also got to play their part. But if you take the example of the Benin bronzes, in southern Nigeria. There is a huge museum that's being built there under the auspices of the Oba of Benin, and he's had very extensive conversations with the British Museum about having some of the Benin bronzes put on display there. So it is a conversation which is fortunately ongoing now.
Now, a striking aspect of all of this discussion about repatriating artifacts is just how politicized history has become, or maybe has always been. Do you think you can ever truly have an apolitical history?
Well, history's always been contested. You're absolutely right. And, there is that saying that you have in Africa that when the lions have historians, then the hunters will cease to be heroes. And so often you do have a history, which is a narrative that is one of the victors. And the victors in the context of Africa obviously have been in more recent years the colonial powers. And so there is an extension of that in that people say, look, the international economic order is still loaded in favor of the former colonial powers and against the Africans. And so when it comes to relating history, it's all part and parcel of this kind of power imbalance which has existed for a long time. And power, of course, is about politics and the maintenance of certain narratives that may suit those who are in power. Is something which one has got to be aware of. And the revision of history, or rather the recasting of it and giving the African perspective, I suppose you could see that as a somewhat subversive act. But really, I think it's just setting history straight, which is very much my hashtag, set history straight. And that's what I'm doing, is that these are valid opinions which cast the African historian and other experts center stage, and really is testament to the hunger of that sentiment. Whenever I go to Africa and I interview experts there, they just want to talk and talk and keep me there, and I have really long interviews because you never see these characters. If you look at these programs, you'll see a whole cast of experts and who really know their history, and they are telling it as they want to. And I've been very much guided by UNESCO's General History of Africa, which is a set of volumes which bring Africa's history from the African perspective. And so if anybody disagrees with what I say to them, well, look, go and take it up with the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, because that's really where I base my facts.
Now, interestingly, you actually spoke with some of the original contributors to the volume. What was that experience like?
Absolutely moving, especially Mukhtar Mbo, who was the Director General of UNESCO, the first African to lead a United Nations agency. And he was instrumental. He was at UNESCO for 13 years, really instrumental in making sure that the General History of Africa maintained its momentum. And he was a man in his 90s. And he said to me at the end of the interview, Zeinab, when I look back on my long life, this is the project about which I am most proud. And I found that extremely moving.
And many people may not know you are actually the executive producer of this series.
I did it all, Bryan. I wrote, directed, produced. Well, I mean, in the first series, I did have some, good help with Bridget Osborne and Lucy Doggett, who also stayed on for the second series. And then we brought James Hickman on for the second series. But it's just, I've seen various series made where you've had lots of cooks, and I think it ends up being very disjointed. And so it was just simpler for me in the end to try to keep everything in my head. And so that's the way I approached it. It was very much a labor of love. It was extremely time consuming, very tiring. We went to more than 30 African countries and off the beaten track, not just, capital cities in plush hotels, not at all. Filming from dawn till dusk, filming with African crews each time, because it's very important they also own the narrative, in terms of the actual film work. And so I think it was something I felt very strongly about, and therefore I had a very hands-on approach to the whole project.
And when you were putting the series together, were you more interested in focusing on the history of the rulers and the ruling elite, or were you more interested in the history from below, the history of the everyday man?
Yes, I mean, this is a problem for all history, of course. It's always the rulers that one knows more about because they are the ones who've been recorded. But where possible, I tried to make sure that we included not only historians, but also what you might want to call, non-historians, the ordinary citizens of these countries, so that they would also contribute to the programs. Um, but obviously, in terms of the characters that we know about, Queen Nzinga in the Congo, Kempavita in the Congo, Kahina in North Africa, and Pianki in Sudan, that it is often a history of kings and queens and nobles, the rulers, because they are named. They are the ones who have the physical depictions of them in sculptures or pictures. And so, just as British students will engage with British history, Henry VIII and his six wives, there is a large part of the road of history to engage people is through personalities, real life characters that you can really relate to and see them depicted. So obviously, the rulers would be the ones who got more of the lion's share of the coverage. But I would hope that we didn't just concentrate on kingdoms, but also looked at chiefdoms. It's not just a history of kingdoms because Africa is more than just kingdoms.
Now, in the academic community, there's sometimes a bit of academic snobbery towards TV history, as it's regarded. Have you had any pushback from the academic community?
Actually, no. The academic community have been very, very supportive. I mean, television is obviously not an academic endeavor. Um, I'm glossing over huge tracts of history in maybe just a minute or two. And some of the subjects I look at are worthy of tomes written about them, and indeed they are. So I don't set out to pretend that I am all inclusive. I didn't visit 54 African countries. I couldn't make 54 programs. So this isn't a history of African countries. It's looking at the regions. And obviously, a lot of these countries didn't exist until relatively recently in terms of history. But I think all I aim to do with this history series is to inform you about aspects of African history about which you didn't know, to excite your interest so that you will go and find out more, and also hopefully to do it sometimes where it's appropriate in an entertaining and engaging way because it is television and obviously every program is 45 minutes, which is quite an investment of time for you young people. And so it couldn't be an illustrated lecture. So there were times when obviously I would do things which were visually rewarding, but maybe argument wise were not so profound, but that's because it is television. So I think the idea is just to say, look, you may hear about an aspect of African history, and I've given you the name, I've given you the year, and so on, or time it happened. You want to go and find out more about the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa, for example. I can only spend a few minutes doing that.
Now, as a producer, would you say that was one of the most challenging aspects of it, striking that balance between entertaining and educating?
Um, yes, although I've been in television for such a long time that, I think that even for complex issues, they have to be told in a simple way. And I don't think that there is any merit in having complex topics dealt with in an obscure way. And so trying to do things in an engaging way, I think I was always looking for ways of human interest, of relaying the story through human interest. So, for example, the first episode about the origins of humankind, it's difficult to have a program that's 45 minutes long that's just about, stones and bones. People are not going to watch that. And so I thought about it very carefully, but I did know about the Hadzabe community in Tanzania, very small community, who live out of choice because they want to, in a way which is very in tune with nature as hunter foragers, in the way that we all would have lived many years ago. And I thought that that would be a good way of illustrating how humans lived as hunter gatherers for most of our history. So, by engaging with this community, it's bringing human interest to something which might otherwise be a bit dry. So, I think that's a very, very prime example. And some people said to me, "Oh, you're just going to fall into the trap of showing Africa through the in inverted commas, exotic tribe lens, which is so condemned and which we all condemn. And I said, no, I'm not taking them out of context. Within context, if you watch the programme, it very clearly states that they choose to live that way and they've been offered accommodation by successive Tanzanian governments. And actually, what a fine example they set to all of us who live in this material world where we have much, much more than we really need. I think we could all learn profound lessons from the Hadzabe community.
Now, what would you say was one of the most rewarding aspects of filming this series?
You know, actually, I was just talking about the Hadzabe community in Tanzania, who are a community who live in the way that our forefathers and foremothers lived. And I would say that actually I found them to be the most profound and the thing that had the greatest influence on me, the group of people that had the greatest influence on me were the Hadzabe community of Tanzania, because we learn about respect for nature from them. We learn about respect for our fellow community members. They don't have a sense of the individual's rights. It's always balanced, against what's good for the community. If a mother has a child and she's not well, she can rest assured that other women in the community will help her, look after that child until she's better. There's a clear division of labor. Everybody pulls their weight. And so I found them extremely profound. Their diet is a very healthy one. Vegans and vegetarians would not approve of it, of course, but we can't dictate to them how they should live their lives. So, of course, they do eat meat, but they have a life that's just stripped of excess. And I think that wherever I go now and I think, might be nice to buy a nice new dress, I'm like, no, you've already got plenty. Don't need to buy any more. So I think they were a great antidote to our fast modern way of living.
And actually, when I was watching that first episode, Mother Africa, I think it was called, it took more of an anthropological turn, which was quite interesting in the series, because the rest of it, I guess it all kind of blends into one, but that one stood out to me as more anthropological rather than historical in its focus.
Yes, that's true. I mean, history and anthropology, work hand in glove. And I did study anthropology, and sometimes I do have an anthropologist's eye. Certainly, one of the programs, program 15, No Longer at Ease, is also quite an anthropological approach, because that looks at how Africans were living in their communities pre-colonial, before the arrival of the Europeans in the up to the 1500s. So that also was seen very much through the anthropologist's lens, because I think in order to understand a people, you need to understand how they order their societies as well. And so sometimes you would, absolutely right, delve into the realm of the anthropologist.
Now, when people are reflecting on African history, it can invoke a sense of white guilt, especially amongst Western audiences. Was this something that you worried about the reception that white audiences would have to the series?
I did think about how people, European descent, white people, would see the series, in particular members of the white community in parts of southern Africa and Kenya who are long settled there. People like Richard Leakey, who's a white Kenyan, whom I interviewed in the first program. I mean, he would be terribly affronted if you said he was anything other than Kenyan. The same with the South African Francis Thackeray and Nigel Penn. Later on in the series, I interview. So I did include these three white African voices to demonstrate that there are people who are white and see themselves as African and have lived there in some cases for hundreds and hundreds of years. Their families have, and so I did include them in the series, obviously numerically not more than these three, how Europeans might view the transatlantic slave trade. Would they feel uncomfortable about it? I don't think the sins of the father and mother should be visited on the children at all. But if it does take an African perspective and not a European perspective, which it doesn't at all, I make no apology for that, because really it's only a tiny drop in the ocean of trying to redress that balance between history of Africa seen through the white perspective and the history of Africa seen through the black perspective. And that's what I'm talking about in the global narrative.
Now, if there's one resounding message that you want people to take away from watching this series, what is that message?
That Africa and Africans have a wonderful history, the longest history in the world, and one which has not just been defined by slavery, one which has taught the world a great deal. Another message is that Africa is the greatest exporter of all time because everybody came out of Africa, all modern human beings. And I think that another thing is for Africans themselves to understand that you can't just retreat into your own nation. And when people say to me, where's the history of my country? Where's the history of my country? This isn't an exercise in nation building by me. This is a history of the whole continent. Your region will be covered, whether it's north, south, east, or west. I can't put everything in it, but I would hope that in 20 45-minute programs that I've at least had as broad a sweep of the continent as I could, and that really it's throwing light on Africa's history from the African perspective. And that's something which the whole world should know, because African history is part of our global narrative.
Zeinab, thank you so much for joining me for this interview.
Best of luck to you and all your fellow students, wherever you may be. Thank you very much for letting me join you on your podcast.
Thank you.